Well, I wanted to begin with a reading, which I think is it's a little longer than usual for this time, but I wanted to share it with you. And it comes from a Episcopalian priest. Her name's Cynthia Bourgeot, and she's author of the book Centering Prayer and Inner Awakening, which is a beautiful um, book that kind of focuses on what I would say is a meditation practice within Christianity. So it's an interesting kind of Christian-based meditation practice, I would describe it as, and she's also just a pretty remarkable person. And she wrote these words. She said, "I once played a trick on my parishioners at Christ Church in Aspen, Colorado. I said to them, 'If Jesus hadn't been raised from the dead, would that make a difference in your faith?' And what I got in response to that was exactly what I expected, these little sermons that were all variations on the Nicene Creed. Yes, of course it would make a difference because by his death and resurrection, he has liberated us from sin. He has established himself as the Son of God. If he had not risen from the dead, our faith would be null and void, and on and on and on, she says. And yes, there are all the right answers from the point of view of lived Christian tradition. But the problem is that couldn't have been what motivated the disciples who first joined him at the Sea of Galilee when he issued that come and see, come and follow. At that point, the story was completely unknown. The crucifixion was not known. The resurrection was certainly not known. Everything was up ahead. And what would have had to determine them at that moment couldn't have been faith in some future salvation as dictated by the Nicene Creed, but some living, profound current that can only be called trust that passed between him and the would-be students of such strength that they were willing to leave their nets and follow him right into the unknown. What could that quality be? And where do we find it in ourselves? Because whatever it is, it's the missing piece to be able to walk that path into continuous living remembrance. At Jesus's Last Supper, he shared bread and wine with his closest supporters and said, "Do this in memory of me." 2,000 years later, we still remember him, although in many different ways, some perhaps not as he intended. We don't really know. But as a theologically open tradition, Unitarian Universalists sometimes struggle with what to do with Easter. Many of us are theologically Unitarian, lowercase u, and view Jesus as fully human. Some of us come from traditions where Jesus wasn't a part of our upbringing. Many of us recognize the miracles associated with Jesus were most likely poetic license from his followers, and a literal resurrection is hard for us to believe. Unlike Christmas, Easter isn't as fully embedded into our culture, so it's not as easy to celebrate outside of its religious meaning like Christmas has become. But for those of us who struggle a little or a lot with this holiday, and also for those who greatly value it, maybe we can all look at Easter as a time to do this in memory of me. Maybe Easter is as simple as a time of remembrance. And that seems to me as powerful an understanding of the resurrection as I can think of. Death did not win. In remembrance of him, Jesus lives on. I was raised as a Catholic in a partially practicing family. We were Christmas and Easter Catholics as far as Mass went, but I did regularly attend religious education and both received communion and was confirmed. And I look back at this time with some amazement. I went to a public school in a predominantly Catholic community, and every Tuesday, all the Catholic students, we would leave our public school every Tuesday afternoon, and we'd get on a bus, and we'd head over to the local Catholic private school for religious education. The few Jewish and Protestant students would stay behind for an afternoon of study hall. I remember in this religious education, the stone hallways, the religious education workbooks we'd get every year enclosed in a sharp folder that if you weren't careful, you'd get paper cuts. And I remember two nuns, one was nice and one was not so nice. I remember being required to go to confession, which always terrified me as an empathic perfectionist of a young boy who struggled with confidence and fears of failure. And I remember the stories. The one that captured me the most, the story of the Good Samaritan. It was a formative story, a story of kindness towards strangers, a story of what it meant to love your neighbor, the golden rule, to treat others as you would wish to be treated. Jesus' stories embedded in me a moral foundation, particularly towards those in poverty. It was our responsibility to lift up those who struggle with food and shelter and care, these stories taught me. While there were many reasons, these stories of Jesus were among the main reasons I stopped being a Catholic. I remember one day being in Mass and noticing the ornamentation of the sanctuary, the fancy marble and the beautiful statues and the gold, and it bothered me to see such wealth in the church alongside such poverty in our community and the world. It struck me as hypocrisy, and I stopped going to church. But I didn't stop loving Jesus. About a decade later, I became a Unitarian, and some years later after that, a Unitarian Universalist minister. And in keeping with our theological openness, I started exploring other spiritual and religious traditions and continue to heavily be influenced by them, including and especially Buddhism. But Jesus kept hanging around, and he came to the forefront again as I entered work with people experiencing homelessness. His words filled my days, and as best as I was able, guided my actions. His words on forgiveness and judgment helped me settle my own hyper self-judgment, and his words on humility and care motivated me in my work. Words like the first shall be last and the last first. Blessed are the poor, for yours is the kingdom of God. He who is without sin cast the first stone. Judge not, lest ye be judged. Love your enemies and pray for those who persecute you. And perhaps most powerfully, for I was hungry and you gave me something to eat. I was thirsty and you gave me something to drink. I was a stranger and you invited me in. I was naked and you clothed me. I was sick and you looked after me. I was in prison and you visited me. Truly, I tell you, whatever you did for one of the least of these, my brothers and sisters, you did for me. And more, I've started to take seriously the traditional Unitarian call to walk in the ways of Jesus. That was among the first promises that we made way back historically in our tradition to walk in the ways of Jesus. It wasn't a theological belief, it was a statement of practice that we walk in the ways of Jesus, that it was a covenant of how to be in the world. And so I started to take seriously that call, while at the same time recognizing the extraordinary distance between that call and my actual life. I find myself increasingly challenged to apply the phrase, by their fruits you will know them, to myself. And to do that, I have to look not just at Jesus's words, but his actions. I don't think we can take Jesus truly seriously until we recognize that he was Jewish and he was raised in a time of war, oppression, and occupation. And much of his words and deeds were in response to this corruption of power. Jesus' death occurred during Passover. His Last Supper was a Passover Seder. Passover was and is a recognition of the Exodus and fleeing the oppression of Egypt. It was and is a celebration of liberation, and it was a time when Jewish people were especially likely to resist their Roman occupiers. Because of that, the Roman governor, Pontius Pilate, on what we call Palm Sunday, came to Jerusalem, riding tall on a war horse surrounded by fierce soldiers to ensure that the people did not think about rising up. On the opposite side of town was Jesus in a very similar procession. He rode not a war horse, but a donkey. He was surrounded not by soldiers, but by the poor. They waved palm branches, a symbol of Jewish resistance to oppression, and shouted, Hosanna, which means save us. It was a mockery of imperial power. I don't think we often think about what Palm Sunday truly was as Jesus came into town on that very first Sunday early in Passover, and why he came in on a donkey with surrounded by palm leaves. He was mocking something else that was happening at the very same time on the opposite side of town. It may or it may not surprise you to know that Caesar at that time was called the Son of God. He was labeled as a divine being, and his power was displayed and reinforced and enforced through violence and spectacle and grandiosity. Thus, this big marching into town on a giant war horse with soldiers and spectacle. And Jesus, who also was called the Son of God, was a man on a donkey. Episcopalian priest Andrew Thayer, in a recent New York Times op-ed, he wrote, but Jesus never sought to replace Caesar with a Christian Caesar. He came to dismantle the very logic of Caesar, the belief that might makes right, that peace comes through violence, and politics is best wielded through fear, coercion, and control. Instead, he inaugurated a counter kingdom that aspires to loving kindness, radical welcome, mercy, and justice. A kingdom where the vulnerable and the poor are lifted up, and the idols of empire are exposed as frauds. Thayer continued, at some point, we have to make a choice about the Jesus we claim to follow. Either he didn't care about the poor, the marginalized, and the oppressed, in which case we've built our religion on a hollow figure, or he did care deeply, and we've chosen to ignore that part because it challenges our comfort, our politics, and our priorities. And he finishes, the resurrection declares that even when the empire kills truth, truth still rises. That even when justice is crucified, it does not stay buried. The Caesars among us don't get the final word. On this Easter Sunday, Jesus lives again as we strive to follow his lead and live like him. That's the resurrection. That's what it means to do this in remembrance of me. We live in an extraordinary time of hatred. We also live in a time of massive wealth and power and violence. And I have to ask myself very seriously, with real clarity, what would Jesus do in times like these? What would he be doing right now if he were living in these times? I know he'd be encouraging us to care for the impoverished and the marginalized. I know he'd be challenging the wealthy and the powerful, both religiously and politically. He'd probably be riding on a donkey somewhere or some variation, and he'd probably be turning over some tables like he did at the temple. I encourage you to think this Easter day and beyond about how his life can shape yours, how his passions, creativity, humility, fire, and kindness can inspire you to live your best life. By their fruits we shall know them. May we each take up the challenge, walking in his footsteps. That is Easter. Shalom, hallelujah, and blessed be.